I'm Stan Bundervoet. I will be moderating what normally was supposed to be a dialogue between artist Johan Grimaud-Pré and a theoretical physician, but I'm sorry to say that the physicist wouldn't be possible to make it tonight. So we will have a presentation by Johan. I will have a talk with him afterwards, and then there will be a possibility to ask questions from the public. I think we should see quantum physics, or well, I should say quantum field theory, as a kind of imaginary friend with us tonight. Because it's maybe what quantum mechanics do, and the breakthroughs which have been done last decades, but also last years, are of that magnitude that it will touch upon any kind of intuition or a sense of reality as we could have. So it's an important aspect which hasn't yet been touched upon within common sense, not at all. So maybe just a short word about myself. I have a background in research in different disciplines. I was a member of Centrum Leo Apostel, which is a interdisciplinary research center, trying to integrate different fields of science, different worldviews. But today I'm a member of the Art Science Forum, which is part of the Centrum Leo Apostel, where we are investigating, thinking with a network of artists and scientists about how we could integrate modes of expression, of exploration in art and science. So that's the reason why I'm here. Let's just mention a few things about Johan Grimaud-Pré, and which I can say is a multimedia artist drawing on what I've seen from him yet on a huge array of mass media information, trying, maybe if I could say like that, trying to bring a pamphlet on what this world, the universe, and all that lives in it and knows within it or not knows, how he could, with a caring, with a sense of caring, how this could be understood. I'll briefly maybe say, I know he draws inspiration from the Frankfurter Schule. I think that this way of doing critical theory, of being as an artist, you could say the same for scientists, that you are part of society, which means you are an active member and an active participator, which altogether already makes a statement about being subjects in society and not objects, and that everything in this society is in the realm of subjectivity. This will touch, I think we will touch upon this subject later on. Okay, I'll give the word to Johan. Thank you very much for coming, Johan. And thanks.
Thank you for the introduction. It's going to be a little bit freestyle. I prepared, but not like in a very strict sense. I collect a lot of clips. I collect a couple of books, and I would like to take you on a little journey, which indeed, we will touch upon not only Frankfurter Schule, talking about participation within society, but also John Wheeler, who says that we actually live in a participatory universe, and even quantum physics, we could talk about, being part of it and not being excluded of it, as a storyteller, part of the story. So this is a little bit the itinerary. So I'm gonna take you through a couple of clips. To find VLC here. And I don't know, first I want to ask how many people have seen a fragment of Raymond Thaler's on tickling, because I thought maybe that's the best introduction. So not a lot of people, so maybe we could see it in full and then take it from there. So I interviewed a neurologist, a professor of medicine of the University of Manchester, who talks about tickling and amongst, also the whole mind matter problem, mind-body problem. As he says, referring to Thomas Nagel, that's not a little local problem, but touches upon larger questions that deal with the whole universe, in a sense. And why tickling? I thought it was interesting when I asked him that question, why can't we tickle ourselves? Because we cannot tickle ourselves. You can only be tickled by someone else. Unless you're schizophrenic, you can laugh with your own tickling. But normally, you can only be tickled by someone else. And he alludes to the fact that that's the ontology of the other, the fact that one, in a sense, knows that the other exists is because there's that relationship. And being a neurologist who's been dissecting brains, comes to the conclusion that actually consciousness is not trapped in your brain, but that consciousness in per se inherently is relational. Just like language, that it actually happens within dialogue. And hence that I thought it was interesting as an introduction. So let's watch Raymond Tallis.
What's it like to work out there, unattached to the shuttle and maneuvering freely in space?
Well, we've had a great deal of training, sir, so it feels quite comfortable. The view is simply spectacular.
The fact that we can't tickle ourselves is quite intriguing, because the stimulus you apply to the skin is the same as the stimulus that somebody else would apply to the skin. So you'd expect your tickling me and my tickling me would feel the same. But it isn't. I can't tickle myself. Tickling is about surprise. Tickling is about a sense of the unpredictability of other people, a sense of their otherness. Probably the most famous moment in Western philosophy is Descartes' cogito argument. I can doubt everything he says, apart from the fact that I am, because the very fact that I'm thinking proves that I am. But if you look a little more closely at that argument, it doesn't deliver all that much. What is the I that Descartes thinks that he's found? By itself, the standalone I is alien in a curious sort of way, because the I, in many ways, is constructed out of we, out of our shared experience of the world. There's a tendency when we think about human consciousness to think of it as something inside our heads. But consciousness, right from the beginning, is profoundly relational. If one was really doing Descartes' insight justice, we could translate it as, we dialogue, therefore we are.
الحديث عن الانحراف فالمنحرف هو الذي لا يتبعه انت اللي وجهت المنحرف هو الذي يقايض المواقف انت انا اخرس لا 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 يا انت اللي بدايه شاكر انت اللي شاكر يا اخوانا
Yes, my head again, I guess, is the... Politics begins in a community of minds. This is a point that was made by Hegel 200 years ago, that a human self-consciousness needs to be satisfied by another self-conscious. It needs to be recognized. There is, as it were, the collective consciousness out there which we're drawing upon to make sense of ourselves. And I think one of the difficult things about a human being is to negotiate the balance between separateness and connectedness. In a sense, we are ourselves only through being in dialogue with others.
Croissant?
That croissant would be lovely. Then Then you have to inspect me for crumbs in my beard, otherwise the audience will be mesmerised by the crumbs in the beard. Thank you. Some neuroscientists start to believe neuroscience can explain everything, even profound and eternal mysteries such as being in love. But as far as I know, and in my own experience of love, it's not just a response to a material stimulus. Being in love is a long story, with all sorts of behaviour. Caring for somebody, desperately wanting to turn up to appointments on time, or equally desperately not wanting to turn up to appointments on time. It consists of being preoccupied by the loved one and wondering what she or he is thinking and so on. And none of that is captured in a response to a simple stimulus. Those who would like to reduce us to the status of an organism often appeal to the notion that the mind is essentially brain activity. Of course, the extreme development of that line of thought is to question whether human beings are conscious or not. The question is clearly self-refuting, because to entertain that question, you clearly have to be conscious. Just like we couldn't be zombies because we wouldn't even form the concept of zombies. There's my tummy rumbling again. God, shit. So I was claiming I wasn't an organism, meanwhile the organism was fighting back. I think in many ways we should be in a state of extreme excitement at the moment, because some of our fundamental ways of seeing the ontology of the universe, the stuff of which the universe is made, is being challenged. Our inability to understand the relationship between brain and consciousness isn't just a little local difficulty. It actually tells us that something fundamental is missing in our understanding of the world. It raises large questions about the relationship between the mind and the cosmos, as Thomas Nagel says. If we try and pretend we already know and can demonstrate that neural activity and human consciousness are the same, then we're going to miss a big opportunity. Can I run with it another way, which is to say that the belief is nowadays that really, if you measure something, you've got its essence. Plotinus, over 2,000 years ago, said, to measure something isn't to grasp it. We must set aside the notion that quantity captures everything.
Okay, when I give you the word, unload for me, Dad. Okay.
Richard Feynman, the great physicist, once said of Schrödinger wave equation, one of the most fundamental equations of physics, it doesn't really tell us whether there are frogs or symphonies or morality in the universe. We need better equations that aren't based just on quantities.
Okay, unloaded now.
We need something better than better equations. We need to recover qualities.
Spacecraft repair right here.
It's number one. Let me quickly open up a couple of pictures that I took myself at CERN, because that was the point of departure. This all came out of visits that were made to CERN, right? And from there, this whole conference series started. So what I thought was interesting when I was visiting CERN is that when I was visiting the control room, I saw all these bottles. And I thought, that's interesting that actually after every new discovery there was sort of a celebration. But that celebration actually says a lot. It means that actually that science is committed in a sense of community, in a sense of consciousness, but also in it as part of a dialogue. And that I thought was interesting. When one visits the cafeteria, you see all these scientists from all over the world sitting together and talking and projecting things out, and then going back to drawing board, making new experiments. And then once they discover something new, there's a bottle that's being cracked, and a new bottle is being added to the series of bottles. I thought that was sort of quite interesting, that if you go through these, the first beam through the atlas, and they sort of perform their artistic skills on the label that has been put after whatever discovery. But there's a celebration which is communal. There's a sense of society that is part of how one commits science. And I thought that was sort of interesting. So you have all these different bottles. Now it's getting serious. 20th of May 2015. Thanks from Alice. Also, there was a poster underneath one of the bottles, which I guess maybe too many people asked about the Higgs boson as the God particle. It's the poster where actually all the things that have to do with God are actually shunned. So if you mention God particle one more time, you know, goddamn time, then we might kill you. So you have all these bottles. That I thought was an interesting phenomenon. Now, what I also thought was interesting is that, you know, you cannot have something that you observe without the observed. And to actually be very, very explicit, this is, and I thought it was so low key, but this is the on and off button of the Large Hadron Collider. It looks like a mechanical button from the 50s, but still, you know, there's that interaction where you're going to press the button on or off. And it's a finger, it's a body, it's a scientist who actually pushes the button. That interaction between the observer and the observed, or the knower and the known, is for me crucial to what we sort of, as a trajectory, we're going to stipulate in the little talk. So this by way of introduction. I want to jump to Richard Feynman. There's a clip that actually Johannes stumbled upon, but I thought it was quite interesting in the way he asked a question about why is it that certain questions are being asked and what are actually the givens, the reality. Maybe reality is not a given, but we all like sort of are standing in this world together where we actually share a reality, share a language, or share certain tools to communicate or to live together. And so Richard Feynman pointed it out in this small discussion. So let's watch another clip. Richard Feynman, question why.
If you get hold of two magnets and you push them, you can feel this pushing between them. Turn it around the other way and they slam together. Now, what is it, the feeling between those two magnets?
What do you mean, what's the feeling between the two magnets?
There's something there, isn't there? I mean, the sensation is that there's something there when you push these two magnets together.
Listen to my question. What is the meaning when you say that there's a feeling? Of course you feel it. Now, what do you want to know?
What I want to know is what's going on between these two bits of metal.
Magnets repel each other.
And, well, then what does that mean, or why are they doing that, or how are they doing it?
You're asking.
I must say, I think that's a perfectly reasonable question.
Of course, it's a reason. It's an excellent question. Okay. But the problem that you're asking, you see, when you ask why something happens, how does a person answer why something happens? For example, Aunt Minnie is in a hospital. Why? Because she went out and she slipped on the ice and broke her hip. That satisfies people. It satisfies, but it wouldn't satisfy someone who came from another planet, knew nothing about things. First, you should understand why, when you break your hip, do you go to the hospital? How do you get to the hospital when the hip is broken? Well, because her husband, seeing that the hip was broken, called the hospital up and sent somebody to get her. All that is understood by people. Now, when you explain a why, you have to be in some framework that you allow something to be true. Otherwise, you're perpetually asking why. Why did the husband call up the hospital? Because husband is interested in his wife's welfare. Not always. Some husbands aren't interested in their wife's welfare when they're drunk and they're angry. And so you begin to get a very interesting understanding of the world and all its complications. In order to if you try to follow anything up, you go deeper and deeper in various directions. For example, you could go, why did she slip on the ice? Well, ice is slippery. Everybody knows that, no problem. But you ask, why is ice slippery? That's kind of curious. Ice is extremely slippery. It's very interesting. you say, how does it work? You could either say, I'm satisfied that you've answered me, ice is slippery, that explains it. Or you could go on and say, why is ice slippery? And then you're involved with something, because there aren't many things as slippery as ice. It's very hard to get. Greasy stuff, but that's sort of wet and slimy. But a solid that's so slippery, because it is in the case of ice that when you stand on it, they say, momentarily the pressure melts the ice a little bit, so you got a sort of instantaneous water surface on which you're slipping. Why on ice and not on other things? Because ice expands water expands when it freezes, so the pressure tries to undo the expansion and melts it. It's capable of melting it. But other substances contract when they're freezing, and when you push them, they're just satisfied to be solid. Why does water expand when it freezes and other substances don't expand when they freeze? All right? I'm not answering your question, but I'm telling you how difficult a why question is. You have to know what it is that you're permitted to understand and allowed to be understood and known, and what it is you're not. You'll notice in this example that the more I ask why, it gets interesting after all. That's my idea, that the deeper a thing is, the more interesting it is. And we could even go further and say, why did she fall down when she slipped? That has to do with gravity. It involves in all the planets and everything else. Never mind. It goes on and on. Now, when you ask, for example, why two magnets repel, there are many different levels. It depends on whether you're a student of physics or an ordinary person who doesn't know anything or not. If you're somebody who doesn't know anything at all about it, all I can say is that there's a magnetic force that makes them repel, and that you're feeling that force. And you say, but that's very strange, because I don't feel kind of force like that in other circumstances. When you turn them the other way, they attract. There's a very analogous force, electrical force, which is the same kind of a question. And you say, that's also very weird. But you're not at all disturbed by the fact that when you put your hand on the chair, it pushes you back. But we found out by looking at it that that's the same force, as a matter of fact, the electrical force, not magnetic exactly in that case, but it's the same electrical repulsions that are involved in keeping your finger away from the chair, because everything's made out of its electrical forces in minor and microscopic details. There's other forces involved, but this is connected to electrical forces. It turns out that the magnetic and the electric force with which I wish to explain these things, this repulsion in the first place, is what ultimately is the deeper thing that we have to start with, we can start with, to explain many other things that looked like they were, everybody would just accept them. You know, you can't put your hand through the chair. That's taken for granted. But that.
Okay, taken for granted. So what Feynman is alluding to is that actually the framework is so important in order to be able to explain the question why. So let me read a little story. It's by Oliver Sacks' Stream of Consciousness. I want to get to the question of consciousness as well. But here is a woman who actually lost a faculty. She's motion blind, and she loses a faculty, which means that actually things that are shared and given as granted are actually taken away, and there's a way where she cannot actually relate anymore to that reality because a faculty is missing. And so this was a study by, written down by Joseph Sill in 1983, and his colleagues, Christoph Koch, in München, published a single very full described case of motion blindness. A woman, following a stroke, became permanently unable to perceive motion. The stroke damaged highly specific areas of visual cortex, which psychologists have shown in experimental animals to be crucial for motion perception. In this, the patient, whom they call L.M, the two initials LM, she's called the patient, there were freeze frames lasting several seconds during which Mrs. M would see a prolonged motionless image and be visually unaware of any movement around her, though her flow of thoughts and perception was otherwise normal. She might begin a conversation with a friend standing in front of the bus, not able to see her friend's lips moving or facial expressions changing, and if the friend moved around behind her, Mrs. M might continue to see him in front of her, even though his voice now was coming from behind her. She might see a car frozen a considerable distance away, but find when she tried to cross the street that the car was now immediately in front of her. Also, she would see a glacier a frozen arc of tea coming from the spout of the teapot, but then realized that she had overfilled the cup, and there was now a puddle of tea on the table. Taking it from Richard Feynman by way of Oliver Sacks and this example of Mrs. L.M., I'd like to take you to what also Raymond Thalers was talking about, the fact that, you know, that mind and the cosmos is actually more linked than actually we would actually perceive. In a sense, when Thomas Nagel in his book Mind and the Cosmos stipulated that actually we're up against a paradigm within physics science that actually is up against the wall. It's what he calls the reductionism of materialism. In that sense that when we project materialism, that actually a big black hole is left out. Big black hole, the blind spot, which is consciousness, is the mind is left out. I'd like to read the beginning of his book. So that with materialism, we have an incomplete picture. The mind-body problem is not just a local problem, having to do with the relation between mind and brain and behavior in living organisms, but it invades our understanding of entire cosmos and its history. We are simply at the point in history of human thought at which we find ourselves, and our successors will make discoveries and develop forms of understanding of which we have not even dreamed of. Intellectual humility requires that we resist the temptation to assume that the tools of the kind we now or in principle that we have now are sufficient to understand the universe as a whole, pointing out that there are limits to our philosophical task. And he continues later, the great advances in physical and biological science were made possible by excluding the mind from the physical world. This has permitted a quantitative understanding of the world expressed in timeless mathematically formulated physical laws. But at some point it will be necessary to make a new start on a more comprehensive understanding that includes the mind. From here I'd like to take it to a next clip by David Chalmers, and he actually postulates that maybe there's new ways of how one could include that blind spot.
When it comes to the hard problem, that's the question of why is it that all this behavior is accompanied by subjective experience? And here are the standard paradigm of emergence, even the standard paradigms of neuroscience don't really so far have that much to say. Now, I'm a scientific materialist at heart. I want a scientific theory of consciousness that works. And for a long time, I banged my head against the wall, looking for a theory of consciousness in purely physical terms that would work. But I eventually came to the conclusion that that just didn't work for systematic reasons. It's a long story, but the core idea is just that what you get from purely reductionist explanations in physical terms, in brain-based terms, is stories about the functioning of a system, its structure, its dynamics, the behavior it produces. Great for solving the easy problems, how we behave, how we function. But when it comes to subjective experience, why does all this feel like something from the inside? That's something fundamentally new, and it's always a further question. So I think we're at a kind of impasse here. We've got this wonderful, great chain of explanation. We're used to it, where physics explains chemistry. Chemistry explains biology. Biology explains parts of psychology. But consciousness doesn't seem to fit into this picture. On the one hand, it's a datum that we're conscious. On the other hand, we don't know how to accommodate it into our scientific view of the world. So I think consciousness right now is a kind of anomaly, one that we need to integrate into our view of the world, but we don't yet see how. Faced with an anomaly like this, radical ideas may be needed. I think that we may need one or two ideas that initially seem crazy before we can come to grips with consciousness scientifically. Now, there are a few candidates for what those crazy ideas might be. My friend Dan Dennett, who's here today, has one. His crazy idea is that there is no hard problem of consciousness. The whole idea of the inner subjective movie involves a kind of illusion or a confusion. Actually, all we've got to do is explain the objective functions, the behaviors of the brain, and then we've explained everything that needs to be explained. Well, I say, more power to him. That's the kind of radical idea that we need to explore if you want to have a purely reductionist, brain-based theory of consciousness. At the same time, for me and for many other people, that view is a bit too close to simply denying the datum of consciousness to be satisfactory. So I go in a different direction. In the time remaining, I want to explore two crazy ideas that I think may have some promise. The first crazy idea is that consciousness is fundamental. Physicists sometimes take some aspects of the universe as fundamental building blocks: space and time and mass. They postulate fundamental laws governing them, like the laws of gravity or quantum mechanics. These fundamental properties and laws aren't explained in terms of anything more basic. Rather, they're taken as primitive, and you build up the world from there. Now, sometimes the list of fundamentals expands. In the 19th century, Maxwell figured out that you can't explain electromagnetic phenomena in terms of the existing fundamentals: space, time, mass, Newton's laws. So he postulated fundamental laws of electromagnetism and postulated electric charge as a fundamental element that those laws govern. Well, I think that's the situation we're in with consciousness. If you can't explain consciousness in terms of the existing fundamentals, space, time, mass, charge, then as a matter of logic, you need to expand the list. The natural thing to do is to postulate consciousness itself as something fundamental, a fundamental building block of nature. This doesn't mean you suddenly can't do science with it. This opens up the way for you to do science with it. What we then need is to study the fundamental laws governing consciousness, the laws that connect consciousness to other fundamentals: space, time, mass, physical processes. Physicists sometimes say that we want fundamental laws so simple that we could write them on the front of a T-shirt. Well, I think something like that is the situation we're in with consciousness. We want to find fundamental laws so simple we could write them on the front of a T-shirt. We don't know what those laws are yet, but that's what we're after. The second crazy idea is that consciousness might be universal. Every system might have some degree of consciousness. This view is sometimes called panpsychism. Pan for all, psych for mind. Every system is conscious, not just humans, dogs, mice, flies, but even Rob Knight's microbes, elementary particles. Even a photon has some degree of consciousness. The idea is not that photons are intelligent or thinking. You know, it's not that a photon is racked with angst because it's thinking, I'm always buzzing around near the speed of light. I never get to slow down and smell the roses. No, not like that. But the thought is maybe photons might have some element of raw subjective feeling, some primitive precursor to consciousness. This may sound a bit kooky to you. I mean, why would anyone think such a crazy thing? Some motivation comes from the first crazy idea, that consciousness is fundamental. If it's fundamental, like space and time and mass, it's natural to suppose that it might be universal too, the way they are. It's also worth noting that although the idea seems counterintuitive to us, it's much less counterintuitive to people from different cultures, where the human mind is seen as much more continuous with nature. A deeper motivation comes from the idea that Perhaps the most simple and powerful way to find fundamental laws connecting consciousness to physical processing is to link consciousness to information. Wherever there's information processing, there's consciousness.
All right, I'll leave it there. All these clips are also online, if you want to listen further. I want to take a little bit backwards back to the participatory universe that John Wheeler postulated, and what's what he calls the participatory anthropic principle, that we are participators in bringing into being not only the near and here, but the far away and the long ago. So if he's correct, the universe is conscious. But what's more interesting is that biographers of John Wheeler, who was the teacher of Richard Feynman said, you know, a lot of people say John Wheeler is a bit crazy in his later days, but Feynman said, no, I think he's always been crazy. But the biography of his life is as such that they divide his life in 3 stages. The first stage was everything is a particle. Everything he studied was then reduced to particles. Second phase was everything is energy or waves. And then the third phase, which people call the crazy phase, but everything is information. So in a sense that maybe, according to him, that the universe is conscious. So this is John Wheeler. Let me jump to another clip, which is by Terence McKenna. Terence McKenna is more like what one would say the kooky sort of new age guru that was dealing with hallucinatory experiences, taking DMT and then trying to explore consciousness from within, which is a very different way of approaching it. And in this clip, he sort of postulates that probably nature is conscious.
Somehow this concept of connectivity is intimately linked to the concept of complexity. And so really what I'm saying is that the universe is getting its act together. It's connecting the dots. It's bringing everything into co-relationship with everything else. And somehow it does this through the production of consciousness. Consciousness is this integrative function in biology which takes data which may appear profoundly unrelated, and in fact brings it into some kind of a congruent relationship. We say an organism coordinates a point of view. Well, in a way, what's happening over time is that the universe is coordinating a point of view. And as it does this, it becomes somehow more aware, more self-conscious, more being-like and less thing-like. You could almost say that nature abhors habit, and so it seeks the novel by producing various kinds of phenomena at every level in biology, chemistry, and society. And so there really is a purpose to the universe. Its purpose is this state of hypercomplexification in which all of its points become related to each other, become what mathematicians call cotangent. And it gives the universe the feeling of being imbued with a caring presence. Well, the great watershed difference between the archaic understanding and what is called scientific materialism is the archaic mind understood, in fact perceived, that nature is conscious. Nature is alive. Nature is an organism full of intent. The goal of the archaic mind is to connect with, communicate with, and align itself to this greater Gaian holism, which is sometimes called nature, the great spirit, the realm of the ancestors. But this is what the archaic mind understood and was comfortable with. And in fact, it is true. Our own decision to view the universe as dead, as inanimate, as unintelligent, allowed us, permitted us to dissect it, use it, and deny its validity outside of human purpose. Now the consequences of living like that is coming back to haunt us. You know, we have...
So indeed, there's a whole new list of scholars that actually call this materialism a fallacy, this whole dualistic split between mind and body, subject and object, nature and culture as projecting nature out there within this material, objectivization process, that actually that's a fallacy, that it's a paradigm that actually is not tenable anymore. And so there's scholars like, for example, Karen Barrett, who would actually, this whole split between mind and matter, or morals and matter, or moral and science, she would try to look in this whole book by Meeting the Universe Halfway, is very much about trying to actually look for that relationship and placing that relationship as a priority. And so maybe I read the first paragraph of the book. So matter and meaning are not separate elements, is what she would call mattering. So it's a whole different sort of point of departure. They are intrinsically fused together, and no event, no matter how energetic, can tear them asunder. Even atoms whose very name, atomos, means indivisible or uncuttable, can be broken apart. But matter and meaning cannot be dissociated, not by chemical processing or centrifuge or nuclear blast. Mattering is simultaneously a matter of substance and significance, most evidently perhaps when it is the nature of matter that is in question, when the smallest parts of matter are found to be capable of exploding deeply entrenched ideas and large cities. Perhaps this is why contemporary physics makes the inescapable entanglement of matters and being, knowing and doing, of ontology and epistemology, and ethics, of fact and value, so tangible and so poignant. So let's jump to another clip of some more of those adherents that actually also would call into question this whole rift. And this is Donna Haraway, who actually made a big move from her Saiger manifesto and this whole techno hype as a techno fix to the move towards companionship and kinship. Although she calls it Otkin, but it's a move towards companionship, towards that relationship.
Now, my friend Anna Tsing, the anthropologist, talks about human nature as an interspecies relationship. And she says everybody knows that about every other species on the planet and thinks that somehow human beings are different. Now, if one takes seriously the notion that human nature is an interspecies relationship at all levels of the onion, and they've folded over in some kind of metamorphic stuff so the onion isn't nicely layered like that. If one takes that seriously, then it becomes actually quite fine to continue to try to think a humanism in that, or some kind of inquiry about the human in that framework. Because among other things, let's say you're interested in genomics and its various consequences, comparative genomics and post-genomics and the rest. Well, you will be looking, I will be really reading for folks who are doing the work for those kinds of traces in our genomes and everybody else's of cohabitations. Now, we already know how to find them in human genomic material for, let's say, histories of the flu. We know how to find the history of pathogens in human genomes because we know how to find, or at least some of these that are viral and integrate themselves through various molecular mechanisms into our DNA and then kind of continue along with us for the rest of time. The kind of, those who used to be pathogens but now are just kind of, hanging out there and, what do we know? We can find the history of our cohabitations for disease fairly readily now. But I'm sure that once we start looking and caring, we will find genomically as well as conventionally, culturally, and so forth, the history of domestication in human genomes. Quite possibly including even certain kinds of biobehavioral, biogenetic modes of attention or arousal states, or who knows. I am perfectly curious, about the traces in us in all ways of material semiotic being of our companion species record as Earth creatures.
So let's move to metagenetics, because again, I'm making a detour through biology, but through metagenetics, maybe we can explore a bit more about what I mean with this relationship. And I want to read something by Donna Haraway where she refers to Lynn Margulis. Lynn Margulis was a biologist who came up with a very different way of how complex life came about. This actually in contradiction to Darwin's thesis of natural selection. And she called it symbiogenesis, which was already like a couple of Russians in the beginning of 20th century had come up with these ideas. They were laughed at the time, but it seems that DNA has proven that actually with the mitochondria that actually cohabitate within cells, that the DNA of those mitochondria and the DNA of the cell are actually completely different different origins, and that actually by way of indigestion, that they were forced to cohabitate and collaborate, and that was the beginning of complex life. Here, Donna Haraway talks about the guts of termites, but also what termites do in the gardening they do with fungi, which they cohabit in their sort of colonies with fungi. They're gardeners. They've been gardeners for about 100 million years. And they cannot digest their food, so they have to vomit their food out, and then it's actually the fungi that actually digest what they're going to eat. Not only that, also within the termite, there's actually sort of a protist. A protist is sort of a microorganism that is a combination of several microorganisms, and they cohabitate with the termite in the tummy, and also the DNA of those protists is completely dependent on the DNA of the termite, and the termite's DNA is completely dependent on that of the protist. And they have been cohabitating for about 100 million years, and which is an example of symbiogenesis. So Lynn Margulis, this is Donna Haraway writing, Lynn Margulis knew a great deal about the intimacy of strangers, a phrase that proposed to describe the most fundamental practices of critters becoming with each other at every mode of interaction in Earth history. The core of Margulis' view of life was that new kinds of cells, tissues, organs, and species evolved primarily to the long-lasting intimacy of strangers. In what she would call the basic and mortal life-making process through symbiogenesis. By fusing with each other in stabilized, ongoing ways, archaea, bacteria invented the modern complex cell with its nucleus full of ropey chromosomes made of DNA and proteins and diverse other sorts of extra-nuclear organelles. The Mixotricha paradoxa, that's what it's called. These are the protists within the gut of the termite, which is Mixotricha, which is mixed up hair, because they have this long sort of organisms hanging out from the protists. And paradoxa, as being paradoxical, is everyone's favorite critter for explaining complex individuality, symbiogenesis and symbiosis. Margulis described that critter that is made up of at least 5 different taxonomic kinds of cells with their genomes this way. Under low magnification, the M paradoxa looks like a single-celled swinging ciliate. With electron microscope, however, it is seen to consist of 5 distinct kinds of creatures. Eventually, it is most obvious the kind of one-celled organism that is classified as a protist. But inside each nucleate cell, where one would expect to find mitochondria, are many spherical bacteria. On the surface, where cilia should be, are some 250,000 hair-like Treponema spirochetes. This is sort of the hair-like mixed-up hair, the Mixotricha in Latin. That, as well as a contingent of a large rod bacteria that also have 250,000 strings. In addition, we have redescribed 200 spirochetes of a larger type and called them Canaparolina darwinensis. So leaving out viruses, each Mixotricha paradoxa is not 1, not 5, not several 100,000, but a poster critter for holobionts. This holobionts lives in the gut of an Australian termite, Mazzoterm darwinensis, which has its own stories to tell about ones and manys, as holobionts termite symbiosis, including their doing with people, not to mention mushrooms as the stuff of legends and cuisine. I want to jump to last clip, or maybe last before clip. And this is Ed Young. He wrote a book, I Contain Multitudes, where he actually postulates that we all actually are a living biotopia, because in our gut, we also as well, we have about 50 trillion cells, but we have trillions and trillions more bacteria living together with us. Without, we would not survive. So in a sense, we all like actually little microtopias. And that's what he calls I Contain Multitudes.
Every animal living today, every hummingbird and hawk, every elephant, every ant, is a teeming collection of other organisms in and on its body. So a human, for example, me standing up here seemingly alone, I am home to about 39 trillion bacterial cells, roughly one for each of my own human cells. So I am at most half the person who I think I am. An ant colony can number in its millions, but every single ant is a colony in itself. A polar bear walking through the Arctic with nothing but ice in all directions is in fact completely surrounded. Bar-headed geese fly microbes over the tops of the Himalayas. Sperm whales dive them down to the bottom of the oceans. And when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin set foot on the moon, they were also taking giant steps for microbe kind. So health, immunity, digestion, development, thought perhaps, all of these aspects of our lives that we think of as the province of individuals are in fact built and influenced by partnerships. We are built in collaboration with the organisms that share our lives and our bodies. And those collaborations matter very much for individuals, for us in our lifespans, but they also matter over much longer evolutionary timescales. Many animals, many groups of animals, owe their extraordinary success to the microbes that they carry. Time and again, bacteria and other microbes have allowed animals to overcome their basic animalness, to succeed at lifestyles that would otherwise have been denied to them. A good example of these are the sap-sucking insects, the bugs or hemipterans, aphids, leafhoppers, cicadas, the ones that are the bane of farmers and gardeners around the world. They can only survive because they have bacteria in their bodies that provide them with nutrients that are missing from their meals, that act as dietary supplements. And without those microbes, those insects would not be able to eat the food that they eat, would not be able to monopolize that source of food that only they can really properly exploit. And that's why there are some 85,000 species of them. And in the deep oceans, there are other animals that have taken this concept of nutrient supplementation to an even greater extreme. There's a worm that's grows up to 2 meters long. It is huge. It creates a tube for itself again and has these red gills that look like a tube of lipstick that's been pushed way out. And its body is full of microbes that provide it with all the nutrients that it needs. In this place where there is no food, the bacteria grab minerals from around the water and provide nutrients to the worm, which has lost its mouth and its gut. Because why bother eating when you have microbes to provide you with all the energy that you need?
So, in a sense, yes, we cannot project nature outside of us and objectify it and then say it's not part of us and then exploit it and then destroy it. If you pollute the water, you pollute yourself, basically. And so it's this whole thing of relationship that actually is in question. And it starts with, by a big detour through, the reductionism of materialism to come to this whole different story of relationship. Maybe I'll finish with one last clip and then maybe we open the dialogue. I purposely didn't zoom in on a lot of the details, but we can do that in the dialogue. I just wanted to throw out a couple of clips and stories, and then take it from there and try to link everything together in the discussion afterwards. But there's one more story, because I do think that actually, as humans, our common denominator is storytelling. And basically, science is also storytelling. And Ursula Le Guin, science fiction writer, tells a story here of how one can imagine that otherness of, if nature is part of it, how can we imagine that otherness as a part of a relationship that can become a dialogue? It's a fiction story, but still it's an interesting sort of way of imagining that relationship. So this is the last clip, and then we can open it up.
I'm going to read you an academic essay, because this is an academic conference after all, and I'm going to read a little talk written for tonight, and then some poems, and then we'll converse. So I'm starting with an editorial by the president of the Therolinguistics Association, written in 1974. And it's from the author of The Acacia Seeds and other extracts from the Journal of the Association of Therolinguistics. What is language? This question, essential to the science of thorough linguistics, has been answered heuristically by the very existence of the science. Language is communication. That is the axiom on which all our theory and research rest, and from which all our discoveries derive. And the success of the discoveries testifies to the validity of the axiom. But to the related yet not identical question, what is art, we have not yet given a satisfactory answer. Tolstoy, in the book whose title is that question, answered it firmly and clearly: art is communication. This answer has, I believe, been accepted without examination or criticism by thorough linguistics. For example, why do thorough linguists study only animals? Because plants do not communicate. Plants do not communicate. That is a fact. Footnote 2014. Though this theory still has many adherents, it cannot now be spoken of as a fact. Therefore, plants have no language. Very well. That follows from our basic axiom. Therefore, also, plants have no art. But stay, that does not follow from the basic axiom, only from the unexamined Tolstoyan corollary. What if art is not communicative? What if some art is communicative and some art is not? Ourselves, animals, predators, we look naturally for an active, predatory, communicative art. And when we find it, we recognize it. The development of this power of recognition and the skills of appreciation is a recent and glorious achievement. But I submit that for all the tremendous advances made by thorough linguistics during the last decades, we are only at the beginning of our age of discovery. We must not become slaves to our own axioms. We have not yet lifted our eyes to the vaster horizons before us. We have not faced the almost terrifying challenge of the plant. If a non-communicative vegetative art exists, we must rethink the very elements of our science. For it is simply not possible to bring the critical and technical skills appropriate to the study of weasel murder mysteries, or batrachian erotica, or the tunnel sagas of the earthworm, to bear on the art of the redwood or the zucchini. This is proved conclusively by the failure, noble failure, of the efforts of Dr. Srivas in Calcutta using time-lapse photography to produce a lexicon of sunflower. His attempt was daring but doomed to failure, for his approach was kinetic, a method appropriate to the communicative arts of the tortoise, the oyster, and the sloth. He saw the extreme slowness of the kinesis of plants, and only that is the problem to be solved. But the problem was far greater. The art he sought, if it exists, is a non-communicative art, probably a non-kinetic one. It is possible that time, the essential element, matrix, and measure of all known animal art, doesn't enter into vegetable art at all. The plants may use the meter of eternity. We do not know.
This was really interesting. I must say there was a lot of the things which we've seen was kind of new for me too. But really interesting. I see, somehow I see what's on your mind now. I see that it's a lot of insights from mostly scientists, I would say, and I see this word coming back of connectedness, interrelatedness, and it makes me wonder, after all I had is maybe it's kind of a personal question, is there some message is there some message which you want to convey relating to the connectedness? Maybe asking this question before we could go in deeper on the different aspects or definitions of connectedness and kinds of connectedness, if I may.
Well, maybe some art is not communicative. No, I'm joking. Yeah. But yeah, indeed, I think we stand in the world, and as an artist, you're part of society, so you stand in the world and you think about the world. So I think that connection to the world and your fellow human is or not even human, but also fellow sort of other critters, what Donna Haraway would call critters, trees or forests or termites, are part of also that sort of universe. And so you stand in the middle of that and you're not separated from it. So yes, of course, this is, but more in a detailed way, it's also the beginning for another project where David van Rijbroek made a theater play called The Soul of the Ant, De Ziel van de Mier, with, which was with Josse de Pauw as a protagonist. And I would like to take this theater play and make it adapt it to a film. And so the termites, because this is based on a character, Eugène Marais, who wrote about termites in South Africa, did some studies in Congo. But this whole idea of the termite was a point of departure to start studying what can I say, what can I do with this whole thing? And I thought, when I stumbled onto the fact that Lynn Margulis was one of the microterm darwinensis, the Australian term that was so prominently featured in the way she would set forth her theory of how actually cohabitation and cooperation is absolutely important in the way one could reconsider evolution and complex life forms, how that came about. Then I thought, yeah, maybe let's take that on. Apart from the Congo and Lumumba and all the other stuff that is the backdrop for this story as well. So there's a political backdrop, but that's a whole other story. This is not the topic for tonight, but we can touch upon it as well.
Okay, that's interesting as well. Yeah, maybe, I don't know, there's kind of some views which were produced on that kind of interrelatedness between things. It's not only, I shouldn't maybe mention things, but subjects or whatever, but that relatedness, does it start from an idea that there are two elements and which are kind of relating in a symmetrical way, and that there's some emergent properties coming from that relatedness, and that we should take that as the base for everything? That's the question which I don't know. No.
Maybe there's a third element, which is the relationship between those two dots, or the 2 points, or 2 entities, or 2 beings. Because I think in a lot of what I've showed during the last 40 minutes is basically that actually that relationship is maybe a priority, and that subjectivity is actually shaped through that relationship. It's just like language. When Michael Howard and Antonio Negri talk about language as being in a common, they put it not in plural. No, commons, it's not a commons, they put it in plural to actually distinguish from the historical word, the common. Is that actually we live in language, but it's a way of actually creating your subjectivity as well. And actually we add to language, we express ourselves, but it's by way of something that we share. It's through that relationship, through that dialogue. And so it's not just 2 separate entities, it's actually the relationship that actually defines also what those 2 things are. It's the relationship as a priority. And I think it's how we stand in the world as well.
Yes, okay, I understand. It's interesting. I think I know of, because at the time there was quite some experiments on I know with robots trying to make robots learn a language from themselves with minimum properties, and to see if that relatedness that was defined really basic by computers, that it would evolve in such a way like we would know that languages. Maybe, I don't know if you can relate to that kind of experiments, but I know Luc Steels at the VUB, he was one of the big maybe protagonists in that kind of way. But there's also experiments with primates where they could teach, I don't know if it's chimpanzees or something, but they were able to teach primates a language. They were able to evolve a language, a science system within themselves, but somehow it's the human act, the human teaching the primates, which made it into existence, because when you see nature, you don't see those kind of languages being evolved. So it makes you think, it relates to the sense of relatedness and coming about of shared commons, but somehow there's some active element, human element in that sense.
It's, I think, precisely that human-centered sort of perspective towards also technology as a technofix that I think is actually a fallacy. I think what's missing in there is morals, but morals or ethics has to do with the fact that we stand in the world together and you're aware of the other. And I think being aware of the other is again that relationship that is lacking in all these things. It's this fallacy of projecting out there a materialist theory that actually doesn't include, you could call it consciousness, but you can also call it ethics, which is the awareness of the other. Because I think consciousness is not just being in this trapped in this individual, but in a subjectivity that is shared. And so what those robots don't share is a morals or consciousness. Now, I'd like to tell another story. Thomas Nagel wrote a first article before he wrote Mind in the Cosmos, is How to Think Like a Bat. And bats have this sonar system where they actually have a sense. It's like maybe also alluding back to that story of Mrs. L.M., who actually misses the faculty of motion. She has motion blindness. And so because of that missing faculty, there's a lack of communication happening. And I think what is crucial is trying to really to get at that otherness in a sense where through that relatedness of sharing this world. Let me give you another example. There is, I don't know if people are aware of echolocation. Dolphins communicate through echolocation. Now, BrainSpeak is a project in California where they're actually trying to analyze what this sort of sonar system is. They've been trying to actually analyze that echolocation, which is by way of waves that they send waves to fellow dolphins. They've been trying to analyze that and actually make a diagram. Now, that's maybe interesting for you if you work with sound. But they were trying to translate that sound through sematics into images. Now, what they discovered is that actually dolphins are in a telepathic communication sending images to one another. They discovered also that every dolphin has a name, a very specific sound. But the sounds were able to, they have made a whole dictionary where they translate the echolocation into, images. And it's because we missed the faculty of actually communicating through a sonar with dolphins. But that doesn't mean, it's like this whole dictum of like the absence of evidence is not the evidence of, is not the absence of evidence. So there is a way of maybe that in another way, because we don't have those faculties or extrasensory whatever, that's not happening. And so it's trying to be aware of that there is an otherness, and you try to communicate in a way. And dolphins do communicate in a way. If you swim with them, there's sort of another thing happening as well. And so it's being open for that otherness, I think. And robots don't do that. There's no ethics involved. There's no consciousness involved, unless, as Thomas Nagel says, Mind in the Cosmos, we can set forward and go beyond that materialist reduction and try to explore another way of dealing with these things, that you would come to maybe different findings. And there's a lot of scientists working with that. There's a whole new area of empathy. Think bonobos, Kanzi. I think you talk, the chimpanzee, it's actually Kanzi who's a bonobo. It's a woman who did that research, who works with, she has 500 words, but it's very often we project that actually monkeys should have a language, but maybe they communicate in a very different way. Whales communicate over oceans with one another as well, and it seems that it's learned behavior. The singing changes according to generations.
Okay. Interesting. Makes me think of there's that little girl which got blind when she was really small, and she's moving through the world through rooms by making sounds and understanding where the walls, the diffraction of the sounds on the walls is interesting also. But I was curious, images they make, but because I didn't understand very well if they make the dolphins make images. You mean like two-dimensional, some kind of space image they try to convey?
Well, they've been trying to translate what the sounds were, and in the rudimentary way trying to make tools to actually try to translate what those sounds are. And so they thought, let's maybe try to translate it into images. So in sematics, how sounds actually make even very complex images. And so they discovered that actually images were being sent in a way. I haven't studied this, it's actually part of one of the books that I thought, it's interesting. But to allude to the fact that awareness of that otherness is so crucial.
Okay, awareness of the otherness and of everything that's around also in one movement, I think. But let's make, because I'm a yeah.
But that doesn't mean that one is trapped in that otherness. Eh? Again, it's about, it's also when I say subjectivities come about through relation, it's not that you lose your subjectivity. It's not at all. It's like also often within the commons, there was been postulated, but that sounds like communism, but it's not, Even the commons is much older, in 13th century, there was a charter of the commons, which is much older than communism. But actually, in communism, the apparatchik is actually dictating what the subject would be. Subjectivity is subjected to the apparatchik. But with the commons, it's actually shared subjectivity, where subjectivity, agency grows by sharing, and that doesn't mean that it nullifies the subject, but it actually gives meaning to its own subject by way in being in relation. It's a very different way of thinking about those things.
Interesting. Okay, maybe something which is a little bit digressing, but did you think in your work as an artist, or maybe this kind of thing, about rituals in that sense? ID being rituals, sharing a kind of commons through certain actions, but there's also that way of interconnectedness being shaped, but also coming back and creating the subjects, taking part in rituals. Just a question.
Well, condensed genetics is there because of rituals, If you used to eat those sort of certain microbes and then they become part of your body, it becomes a genetic thing, and then it condenses into it becomes your body. But that doesn't mean your body has to stay like that. There's, for example, there's a lot of talk about, sexual identity, for example, where there's a fungi that has triple or quadruple chromosomes in a way of XXXX, but it could also be XY, 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 or it could be Y, 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 Y. So they don't have a double sex like female or male or transgender. They have like thousands of sexes, and they can combine each other in a way that is quite interesting. And so, genetics is malleable. I think this whole new study of epigenetics or metagenetics, that actually is that genetics are a condensation of our rituals, of our storytelling. I would call it, rather than rituals, I would talk in the way of how one creates a story, and stories become part that we inhabit, and then they become sort of condensed into paradigms that we don't actually, question anymore. Maybe because, in a way, we've lived so long with sort of hard physics that has become sort of a thing that we have accepted, and our body also became in a way adapted to that. So how over millions of years rituals and stories become sort of hard facts, but then that doesn't mean it has to stay like that.
Okay. Yes, I think it would be, I understand the idea of storytelling. Rituals maybe points to the active part in it. It's a kind of act which is the basic constituent in this. But I think maybe, no, I forgot. There's one thing away. Yes, have you thought about, because it's a whole different thing, of the whole theory about mirror neurons trying. If you're talking about having access to the otherness of other people, does it take part in it? You could see it maybe as a reductionist vision of that kind of otherness. But there's a lot of work being done in that, and we are actually able to simulate and to feel exactly what someone else is doing, or what we would suppose he's feeling, and in imagination. Just a question.
Well, Remontalis would call it neuromania, being trapped with your neurons, or that neurons would actually dictate what consciousness is, or how we stand in the world, or how we tell our stories. Is that, I think we mistook, it's Buckminster Fuller who said, we mistook the telephone for the conversation. And mirror neurons, yes, it's a way of explaining how, in a lot of stories about empathy, how one actually, was done in Bologna in an experiment with I think it was a chimp, and he came in and ate something, and then the reader was still on, and they could measure what the neurons was sort of fluctuating, and when he ate, the same neurons were actually lighting up that actually had to do with eating. And so hence mirror neurons, that actually there's a sort of empathic bond of what you see is sort of affected, and it lights up the same parts of the brain. But I still would conceive it as a sort of a reduction to just making mind as being part of the brain, as being neurons firing. And Raymond Tallis says, even when you talk about, there's all these discoveries about, now we have found the love neuron, but, what does that mean, for love, you have all these faculties that have to come about. And I'm with him when he says, I don't think mind is trapped in the brain. If you talk about panpsychism, and one talks about the fact that, hardcore materialists say, okay, consciousness is trapped in the brain, or maybe consciousness doesn't even exist, it's just neurons firing, is that when you question further, but then what is matter? What is matter? And so if you dissect matter, what is that? It's a frequency. And what if consciousness, there's Robert Sheldrake, who talks about the morphogenetic field, is actually that maybe consciousness is a vibrating field, or memories at least, or maybe caught in frequencies that are hung, or actually part of how that connects to your brain, to your neurons. And so maybe it's not what we really think it is. If we already decide that the mind is neurons, then actually we're setting ourselves a trap, and it's too minimal a story. It's again trying to shut out what consciousness is all about. And I think consciousness is larger. I think consciousness is larger than our body. I think it's larger than our brain. What it is, I don't know. If dolphins can actually send messages by sonar, by frequency, think further. I think we're so trapped in this, what literally I would also call it neuromania. It's too obsessed with neurons, too obsessed with genetics, genetic determinism. But now we know that actually genetics is not that deterministic as we think. Epigenetics can change, your genetics can change over a lifetime. And it's actually not, it's actually the proteins that decide a lot which gens are turned on and off, for example. Anyway.
Yeah, we could go on and on. Maybe just something you touched upon, we are beyond matter, you conceive matter as energy. There's also this kind of notion of, if you take quantum physics, that distributions of probabilities are what it's about. That's in fact the quantum state of which we should study, and the whole idea of even probabilities or potential states interacting with each other and making reality, as we know. How would you relate this to the idea of connectedness and maybe the idea of consciousness?
Again, that word reality, what is that, right? When Richard Feynman is tapping his seat and saying, while touching the chair, but we never questioned that. Magnets are a bit weird because it's not the way it's supposed to react, and as all the other matter we touch. I want to take it back to David Bohm when he talks about the imperfect order and, the collapse of the wave or the velocity versus, the particle, and that there's the probability and there's the uncertainty of is it either that. He says maybe it's actually solvable in another way through dimensional shift, in a sense. He compares always this whole wave-particle dualism as a way, if we look at a fish in an aquarium and you put a camera on top, on the left, facing the face of the fish, and you put a camera on the side, facing the fish from the body, you get a very different picture. And one camera would be the wave, the other camera would be the particle, but still the same fish. And so you can stick with the image that the camera has filmed, but if you go on another level where you go to the fish, it's actually a fish. And so this whole uncertainty is just that on another level. We all know, I don't know if people know the whole story by Tabot, Flatland, where Mr. Square is meeting Mrs. Sphere. Carl Sagan used to tell this in his program, that if the sphere passes through 2D land, it becomes a little dot and then a bigger circle, bigger circle, bigger circle. And Mr. Square is confused and doesn't know what the sphere is. And so if you take it from 2D to 3D and you make a dimensional shift, and that's what's happening. Mrs. Sphere takes Mr. Square out of 2D and takes him in 3D, and he has a godlike experience, comes back to 2D, and he says, listen to me, I had like a godlike experience. I saw a sphere. And nobody believes him because they all stick in 2D. And so I think this whole thing about uncertainty is a matter of a dimensional shift where there's something unimaginable, and this is again the mind of the cosmos, what Thomas Nagel is alluding to, that if we would accept that we have to make that dimensional shift, including consciousness, maybe we would come up with solutions that are completely sort of out of whack, where we end up somewhere completely different. And so I think the tools, if we reduce what we know of the world through our tools, then we're going to miss out on a lot of stuff. It's not that you have to reduce your reality to your microscope or to your eye. Even the eye, what we see is only a very minimal spectrum. You know, I just heard bees don't see poppies, so they don't go to the red flowers because they don't see red. But I think the uncertainty principle is that. I think we miss out on something that we don't understand yet that actually is solved in another way with different tools. I don't know, you know.
Okay, thanks. Maybe one last question. It's more about what the idea was about this conference. What do you think an artist, because you're talking about a lot of scientific insights, what could an artist bring? What would be the position of an artist towards a scientific community?
I think it's precisely that idea of storytelling, changing the story. I think is so crucial, and I think every artist, in essence, is actually political in the way that actually he wants to reclaim the story. And an artist endeavor can be a collaborative effort as well. It doesn't mean that there have to be, you know, the artist is the genius, the Kantian genius trapped in this, you know, subject creativity of the individual. But it's basically reclaiming that story and changing the story, not accepting the ruling paradigm of what's being told, but actively pursuing a new story, whatever that is. But I think that role is quite crucial.
It's a kind of resistance.
It's resisting and reclaiming and retelling as well. It's not just resisting. Resisting is maybe important, but you know, learning from the last film, which was about the corruption of the global arms trade, I learned that actually you can keep going on about telling what's wrong with the world, but I think we have to build another world, and I think it's as important to actually try to conceive where do we take it from here. And in that sense, I get a lot of inspiration by people like Donna Haraway and Anat Singh, collaborator of Donna Haraway, who both teach, who set up this department, the History of Consciousness department at Santa Barbara, where they also say, you know, we had enough of this technofix and this whole sort of trap that we're in. It's time to look for sort of that kinship towards companionship, and I think that's so crucial. And in that sense, I think as an artist, it's so important to not only resist, but also come up with different stories that actually how you stand in society.
And come back to society.
And building society. I think we're so disconnected. This is another thing that I think is so disconnected, that the whole fallacy of materialism also reflects itself in a way how social Darwinism was justifying this whole way of greed, and greed that actually the engine of economics, but economics as sort of the only denominator of how one could commit politics, and everything is being privatized, which results in the whole lobby corporatocracy grabbing a hold of more and more money, and profit is the only denominator. Profit is the only way of how I can advance society, but that's bullshit. And that's a whole fallacy. It's again only looking at what's material, what's profit. And I think it's time for a different story as well. It's the same thing. And I think at the crux, I think it's a scientific paradigm that actually defines that story for a big part. And it's illusory. It's completely false.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Johan. I think it's time for some questions.
It's a rather stupid question, but just, you know, the idea that we were going inside, like the gut and the termite, and this idea of going small. Your first images were clearly, you know, about the cosmos and kind of what lied beyond our limits. So I was just wondering if this tension between going small and going big, and there was a sense that we were narrowing in, zooming in quite a lot towards the end of your clips. And I just thought, is there a way of zooming out and that we could kind of reverse this telescope on us and not see us as the seed of some kind of, internal collaborations, but something external. Last week was very much about aliens. And I was just wondering if there's a way that we can actually see ourselves cosmically as, connected to some other forms that lie outside of us, quite physically.
Well, there's two directions, right? You take a dot and you make it smaller and smaller and smaller, but to make it bigger, it becomes a circle, and it becomes bigger, it's the Earth, and then it's the solar system, it's the galaxy, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I think both directions are at one point, they touch one another, I think. There's a couple of scientists set forth that actually you have a black hole in every galaxy, or maybe the Big Bang, the other side of the Big Bang, and it's not big, and it's not a bang because it was not big, it was small, and it's not a bang because there was no sound. And then what's before the Big Bang is the black hole, the white hole. And so there's maybe something where, on a minuscule level, that the nuclei, why is there spin? Why keeps an atom or an electron keeps on spinning? Is maybe inherently because they're dancing in and out of existence. The gravity of the particle is that maybe there's a black hole there, but what is a black hole? That there's a mini black hole in the nuclei. And so the big black hole of the Big Bang are maybe completely related in a dimensional dance. And so also the Big Bang is a big question, because they found these gravitational walls that are so big that actually, if the Big Bang is 13.5 or 16 billion years old, those walls are actually already 200 billion years old. So something doesn't add up. And the age of the Big Bang has been pushed, it was 3 billion and 4 billion and 10 billion and 11 billion, has been changing constantly. But I think those things are interconnected. There's again that relationship that I think. And I think we have to envision that maybe the cosmos is not out there, and this microcosmic world is not also like that objective. We're all part of that. It's a participatory universe, as James Wheeler says, that actually we're part of that. When it comes to the idea of alien, is that I think we have to be open for the mystery of consciousness, because I think, again, the Drake equation of saying, okay, or saying even, aliens could never have come here because they're not that intelligent. I had another clip that I saw yesterday that Johannes collected. We reduce intelligence to how we think what is intelligence. It was about, lifting a spacecraft. Another phallic symbol of like, getting out there in space and conquering. But it's not about that. I think if you want to find the answer to aliens or alienation, it's not about that. It's about consciousness and about species. And I think they're right in front of your nose. It's the termites, the microbes, it's the dolphins. They're right out there. And it's not an alienation. It's not an alien. It's actually a proximity. And if you accept that, I think that's the big shift that has to happen, that the cosmos is so close, that the mystery is so close, that it's actually there, it's in your gut, but it's also out there, and you're connected to it. Connected in a way where we wouldn't even realize. If you swim with a dolphin and that frequency transfers your body, literally, then it's a proximity. It's not out there. It's out there as in there and inside and outside. And I think we are the aliens. We have become so alienated of what it is to be in this universe, in this world. A world that we share, by the way. So I think we are the aliens. And it would be ridiculous that, there wouldn't be ETs out there or in here. When John Mack, who's a Harvard professor who actually started in 1992, he threw the first alien abductee conference together with David Pritchard, a quantum physicist. Of course, he was laughed at, but he was referring to the Truman Show. And the Truman Show is that this guy is actually trapped within this whole show, which is actually the way we define reality and the way we see our materialistic universe. But if you prick through that, through the Truman sort of bubble, that actually, again, if we reduce to what we know from the world or about other consciousnesses in plural out there, if we reduce that to what it is that we can actually know, then I think we're missing the ball. And it's again, you know, the big conclusion of that conference was where there was, you know, several people who have been abducted by aliens and explaining their stories. But he says, we have to understand that the way we define reality is not adequate to understand what's going on when it comes to consciousness meeting consciousness. It's actually trying to embody that consciousness to the level where you can understand. And then that's where I think we will meet the other. It's about encounter when we talk about ETs and aliens. I don't know if I make sense, but
I think you alluded to the question of the artwork, and so we know your video work, and we know the kind of art you produce. But just, I mean, again, quite simple. Where does tonight stand in that? Because you seem to be articulating a kind of program, a rhetorical program that could allude to something without touching it. Really, it was a sequence of moving images or readings, and it created an interesting form, which would be, again, I mean, idiotic to reduce to the performance. But there was something in the form that allowed something to happen without becoming performative. So I was wondering, as an artist, researcher, if you could touch on what we saw or experienced tonight, and where that fits in a larger argument. If that, it's very simple, but how at what point can the self-reflexive impact the actual content of your work?
There's a methodology that Donna Haraway alludes to, which is diffraction, where, you know, if a mirror falls apart and you have all these different refractions and you have very different ways of approaching a subject matter, I think that's sometimes interesting to get to know something of how other people think about that and how one can approach the subject matter. Is that a methodology? Maybe. I think there's something of an intertextual sort of cross-fertilization that I think is interesting in the way where 1 and 1 is maybe 3, and it is when I construct my films, it's very much part of that, where I'm trying to look for juxtapositions where, because in the contradictions something is opening up in a way that is a third reading. It's again that relationship, looking for the relationship between different stories and how, in the way it's fractured, becomes another story and bubbles and drifts above like an iceberg above the water. I hope that explains a bit maybe the methodology, but Niels Bohr also, to go back to quantum physics, he says the closer you get to the truth, the closer you can actually also postulate its counter arguments. That actually, the closer you get to the truth, the closer you work with contradictions. And I think that's interesting, that, you know, reality is so more complex than just a simple story, is that sometimes you can feel sad and happy at the same time. And I'm interested in those moments where, you know, things bounce off one another and something opens up. And so it's the contradiction, just like a cartoon in a newspaper where some contradictory things are said. Or Wittgenstein, who says, you know, maybe truth is like a joke because it can contain contradictions. And it's because things are juxtaposed as well. But this was very spontaneous, huh? This was sort of like on the go, trying to put some things together upon invitation of Johannes and the class. And of course, I talk from my own experience. These are the things that occupy me now for the next film. Because Lynn Margulies, the termites, opening up consciousness, all of that is part of the new film as well. So,
yeah, there's relating to quantum physics as that it's related to what you say. There's the idea about quantum determinism, and for example, you have the experiments on entanglement. They just did huge experiments on this long distance entanglement between particles, and they said, okay, or disentanglement is happening, or there is no hidden variable. That's the kind of theory. There's no hidden variable, so we have proved that disentanglement is really happening without the need of other variables. There's nothing hidden. That's the reality. Or they say it's the superdeterminism theory, where everything was fixed on before, and that everything was to be like it is because it was fixed before. And that's also that in approaching the truth of indeterminism, they are posing the idea that it could as well be superdeterminism. So somehow they are on the verge of something, and it can go in either direction still. It's a strange kind of.
But what if, on another level, that this entanglement of every nuclei, that this dance of black holes in and out of existence, that the entanglement of every nuclei, on another level, all is one dot? That every nuclei of an atom or particle is actually collapsing in another dimension as entangled being just one thing. It's another theory about entanglement. Well, multiverse is the way it diffracts, and then how that entanglement opens up in a whole dance. But in another, say, 22nd or the 130th dimension, that entanglement is that all the, just like with Mrs. Sphere and Mr. Square, that on another level, all these nuclei are actually just collapsing into one. And there's something to be said for that, but anyway, this is maybe another discussion. Is there more questions? Or more comments or feedback, or
maybe just one question I had because I'm a musician. Have you thought about music as a tool for? I don't know how to explain this. If a lot of theories and insights in quantum physics, for example, are written on paper, or they are kind of geometrical, or a kind of. It is always on a carrier which is like paper, but if you try to get a sense of continuum, infinity, wave functions, and those things, they have to approximate them with mathematical formalism. They put this on paper. But if you would use sound, music, would there be another world of communication and another scientific way of viewing if you would use that as a basis? I don't know if you ever thought about this. It's something which is astonishing me.
Maybe I want to answer in a whole different direction. But for the next film, the whole termite exploration is two entomologists in Congo, beginning of the 60s, when Lumumba was murdered right after the independence in Congo, and also Hammarskjöld around the same time was murdered. I say murdered because there's a new investigation how his plane was sabotaged. But at the same time, Louis Armstrong was invited to play. I think Congo was independent for maybe 3, 4, 5 months, and Louis Armstrong was asked to play in Katanga, which Katanga was then a separate country, was succeeded from the rest of Congo. And Mobutu has just grabbed, not fully, but Lumumba was already in prison, was being tortured, and he was about to be killed. So Louis Armstrong is being sent by the State Department, the US State Department, to actually give a soundtrack to basically a coup d'etat. So I call it the soundtrack to a coup d'etat. Is that now I'm actually reading up on all the jazz diplomacy that actually in the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, it was actually, well, I think 15 countries got independence in 1960 in Africa. Africa was suddenly on the map because it was more beneficial for the United States and for Russia to actually grab away the colonies from all these different European countries to actually reclaim their resources, of course. And so in this whole Cold War arena, Congo featured very prominently. But not only Congo, also the Middle East, because of the oil and stuff. And so I was tracing with this, the jazz musicians, Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, David Brubeck, who was sent to Russia, Duke Ellington, who actually did the whole, from India, Pakistan, Iran, all the way Middle East, Egypt. Egypt was a hotbed at the time with Nasser, that actually the State Department was sending musicians in, actually really to sort of win back the sort of soul and try to actually make a buffer zone for communism. And so if you look where all these jazz musicians went, it's exactly the friction zones. And so here we have Duke Ellington in Baghdad, I'm talking 1963, and everybody in Baghdad is sitting in front of the television. And what happens is that after everybody in the city was watching Duke Ellington, a coup d'etat happens. And it was instigated by the CIA, and it's actually put in place the Ba'ath Party, which later on was the tutor of Saddam Hussein. This is 1963. Even with Louis Armstrong, it's exactly when Mobutu was being paid for by the CIA and also the Belgian government. And you see bit by bit with this jazz diplomacy that you could trace all the coups d'etats in connection to the jazz musicians. So it's sort of a soundtrack, really literally soundtrack to the coups d'etats. So anyway, against sort of this whole story of the termites, you anyway, it's not actually on topic. I didn't answer on topic. But just to say that actually, you know, even music is not innocent. You know, mathematics is not innocent. I know, I forgot his name. There's this mathematician from Prague, I believe. He was trying to come up with this, trying to solve a mathematical formula with infinity as part of the equation, and he went mad. He couldn't, his head could not contain what infinity was all about. He went nuts. And so I think mathematics is not innocent. There's always a context, which is, this is the why that Richard Feynman is alluding to, that actually, you know, there's a context that is bigger, that actually sort of is I wouldn't say the ideological context, but which is the backdrop of how one reads the world and reads that story. And so it's interesting to open up that whole, you know, they call them the jambassadors, but to open up that story about the music. Anyway, we're off topic, but...
Okay, thank you very much for the remark on music, finally. Thank you very much, Johan, our imaginary quantum physicist, which is not there, and thank you everybody for coming. And I think we can have a talk afterwards. Yeah, okay.